A house does not become haunted because the dead remain there. Sometimes it becomes haunted because the living refuse to come home. The thought entered Caleb Whitmore's mind as his carriage climbed the narrow coastal road toward Ravenshade Manor, though he would never have admitted to such sentiment aloud. The rain had followed him for the last 20 miles, hard and silver beneath the late November sky, striking the carriage roof with the steady patience of a clock counting down to judgment. Beyond the windows, Cape Elizabeth blurred into gray cliffs, black pines, and the distant white pulse of the lighthouse turning over the Atlantic. 8 months had passed since Caleb, Duke of Ashbourne, had left his bride in the manor by the sea. 8 months since he had placed a ring on Grace Ellery's slender hand, given her his name, his household, his protection, and then departed before the breakfast silver had been cleared. He had told himself it was necessary. There were shipyard accounts to settle in Boston, family holdings to inspect, obligations that demanded a man's presence more urgently than a wife he had never promised to love. Yet as the horses slowed before the iron gates, Caleb felt the old unease stir beneath his ribs. Ravenshade had always looked less like a home than a sentence. Its grey stone walls rose from the cliff as if carved from the same weather that beat against them, its tall windows once dark with neglect, its chimneys often cold, its halls so silent that even servants learned to walk as if sound itself were a sin. He remembered leaving Grace there in her pale traveling dress, her white skin almost translucent in the morning light, her quiet eyes lowered not in submission, but in restraint. She had not begged him to stay. That had made leaving easier. Or so he had believed. The carriage stopped. His footman opened the door, and the smell of rain, salt, and wet earth rushed in. Caleb stepped down, pulling his black coat close against the wind, prepared to meet the same lifeless house he had abandoned. But the moment the front doors opened, he stopped. Warmth moved toward him. Not the thin, formal warmth of a fire lit for appearances, but a living warmth, rich with beeswax, polished wood, and bread fresh from the oven. Lamps burned along the entrance hall. White heather stood in copper vases upon tables that had once held only dust. Somewhere beyond the grand staircase, a child laughed, quickly hushed by an older voice, and from the east corridor came the low sound of piano notes, imperfect but tender, as though someone had taught the manor to breathe in music. Caleb did not remove his gloves. He could not. His house had become unfamiliar. No, worse than unfamiliar. It had become alive without him. The butler, Mr. Rowe, bowed with a dignity Caleb remembered, though there was something changed in the old man's face, some guarded brightness that had not been there before. "Your Grace," he said. "We were not informed of your arrival." "We." "Not I." "Not the household." "We." Caleb's gaze sharpened. Clearly. He looked past him toward the hall, where a small girl in a patch-wool dress peered from behind a maid's skirt before disappearing with a muffled giggle. "Are we sheltering half the village now?" Mr. Rowe's expression did not move. "Only those Her Grace believed the storm might endanger." Her Grace. The word settled heavily. Caleb turned just as footsteps sounded from the corridor. Grace Ellery appeared beneath the archway, a slender figure in an ivory gown that had been mended at one sleeve and softened by wear. She was still pale, still delicate, her fair hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck, her hand resting for the briefest moment against the wall as if strength were something she borrowed carefully. Yet she did not look like the abandoned girl he had left behind. There was color in the house because of her. There was order because of her. There was life because she had refused to become another ghost in his family's rooms. Caleb waited for accusation. For tears. For the tremble of a wife wronged beyond courtesy. Grace gave him none of it. She crossed the hall with measured calm, stopped several feet away, and curtsied as if receiving a guest. Her eyes met his, clear and gentle and impossible to read. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said. The sentence was quiet. Polite. Perfectly proper. And somehow, it struck Caleb harder than any anger could have done. Because in that moment, standing in the doorway with rain on his coat and silence in his throat, he understood the first cruel truth of his return. Ravenshade had become a home. But not because he had come back. Grace did not ask why he had come back. That troubled Caleb more than any question could have. She merely turned to Mr. Rowe and instructed him to have a room prepared in the west wing, as if the master of Ravenshade were an unexpected caller who needed dry linen and a place near the fire. Caleb stood in the entrance hall with his gloves still on, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, watching his wife move through his house with the soft authority of someone who had earned every inch of it. The servants obeyed her without fear. That, too, troubled him. In his father's day, Ravenshade had been ruled by silence and polished discipline, every meal served with a stiffness that made hunger feel improper. Now a maid crossed the hall carrying a basket of folded blankets, nodding to Grace with open respect. A young footman hurried past with a tray of mugs, the scent of cocoa rising through the cold air. Somewhere near the kitchen, a boy sneezed, and instead of being scolded, he was gently told to sit closer to the stove. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I did not realize my home had become a public shelter," he said. Grace paused beside the staircase. The lamp behind her turned the edges of her fair hair gold, though her face remained pale with the delicate exhaustion he remembered too well. "It is only for the night," she replied. "The tide road has flooded, and 2 fishing families were caught between the harbor and the cliffs. There are empty rooms here. There are rules here. There were empty rooms first." The answer was not sharp. That made it sharper. Caleb looked at her then, truly looked, and found no trace of apology. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged his title. She had simply placed human need beside old custom and found custom wanting. For one breath, the hall seemed to narrow around them. Then the child he had seen earlier slipped from behind a column and ran toward Grace with a wooden button clutched in her hand. "Your Grace, Mrs. Bell says this came off Thomas's coat." Grace accepted it with a warmth so natural that Caleb felt strangely intrusive for witnessing it. "Then we shall save it for the morning. Tell Thomas he must not lose himself as easily as he loses buttons." The little girl smiled, then noticed Caleb and shrank back. Grace saw the movement. "This is His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne," she said gently. "He lives here." The child blinked at him with honest confusion. Caleb felt the words settle under his skin. "He lives here." As if it required explanation. As if he had become a portrait, a name, a rumor carried by staff and sea wind. Grace sent the child away, then turned back to him. "You must be cold." "I am quite well." "Of course." She lowered her eyes, not submissively, but with a tired courtesy that somehow shut him out more completely than a locked door. "Dinner will be served in 30 minutes, unless you prefer a tray in your study." His study. The room he had fled to as a boy when his mother's cough echoed down the corridor. The room where his father had taught him that grief should be folded away like estate papers. Caleb removed one glove slowly. "I will dine in the dining room." Something almost like surprise passed across her face, gone before he could be certain. "Very well." She turned to leave, but a faint cough caught in her chest. It was small. Controlled. The kind of sound a proud person tried to bury. Caleb's attention sharpened at once, though he made no move toward her. "You are unwell." "I have always been unwell, Your Grace." "That has never required your attention before." The words were quiet. They did not accuse. They only remembered. Caleb stood very still. Rain tapped against the tall windows. From the kitchen came the soft scrape of chairs, the murmur of grateful strangers, the life of a house he had once condemned to stillness. He wanted to tell her that he had not meant to be cruel. He wanted to explain the shipyards, the debts, the old fear that rose in him whenever a frail woman stood beneath this roof. But explanations, he discovered, sounded thin inside his own mind. Grace had lived with consequences, not intentions. She had woken each morning in the house he had given her, and emptied of himself. At dinner, they sat at opposite ends of the long walnut table, the same table where generations of Whitmores had mistaken distance for dignity. Between them stood silver candlesticks, white heather, and a bowl of winter apples. Caleb noticed the changes one by one. The cracked plaster near the fireplace had been repaired. The curtains had been cleaned. The old portraits had been dusted, though his mother's remained turned slightly away from the candlelight, as if Grace had known not to force the dead into brightness too quickly. "You have altered many things," he said. Grace unfolded her napkin. "Only the things that were rotting." His hand still beside the glass. "And did you find much rot?" She met his gaze across the candles. "More neglect than rot." There it was. Not anger. Not triumph. Merely truth, placed gently on the table between them. Caleb looked away first. That night, long after the last fishing child had been carried to a guest room and the final lamp in the kitchen had been lowered, Caleb did not sleep. He stood in the corridor outside the west wing chamber that had been prepared for him, listening to the Atlantic breathe against the cliffs below Ravenshade. The house had never sounded like this in his memory. It had always been a place of held breath, of servants moving like shadows, of doors closing softly upon things no one dared to name. Now, even in darkness, it seemed alive. A coal shifted in a distant grate. A floorboard answered the wind. Somewhere below, a kettle gave one faint metallic sigh as it cooled. These were ordinary sounds, domestic sounds, and they unsettled him more deeply than storm or silence ever had. Caleb took a candle and walked the upper gallery, drawn by an ache he had refused for years. At the far end hung his mother's portrait, half turned from the light at dinner, now visible in the narrow glow. The late Duchess of Ashbourne had been painted in spring silk beside an open window, her hand resting on a book she had likely never been allowed to finish. She had possessed the same fragile whiteness Caleb had seen in Grace on their wedding morning, the same careful stillness of a woman taught not to trouble the room with her suffering. As a child, Caleb had watched his mother fade inside these walls, not all at once, but by inches. A missed breakfast. A shawl pulled tighter. A smile offered too late in the evening. His father had not been unkind in any way society could condemn. He had provided doctors' rooms, servants, carriages, accounts. He had provided everything except himself. That was the lesson Ravenshade had carved into Caleb before he was old enough to understand it. A man could fulfill every duty and still leave a heart to freeze. When Grace Ellery had become his wife, Caleb had seen the past standing before him in a white gown. Her hand had trembled only once during the ceremony, so slightly that no one else had noticed. But he had. He had noticed the faint blue shadows beneath her eyes, the controlled breath, the polite courage that looked too much like his mother's. Panic had risen in him, quiet and suffocating. He had told himself that distance would protect them both. If he did not offer tenderness, she could not grow dependent on it. If he did not linger, she could not mistake duty for love. If he did not watch her weaken beneath his roof, he would not have to become the boy in the hallway again, listening for a cough that meant morning might not come. Such reasoning had sounded noble from Boston, surrounded by ledgers, ship timber, and men who measured the world in tons and dollars. Here, beneath his mother's painted gaze, it sounded like cowardice wearing polished boots. Caleb moved on, past rooms long unused, until he reached the east corridor. A line of soft light glowed beneath one door. He knew it must be Grace's room. Not the Duchess's formal chamber his grandmother had once occupied, but the smaller room overlooking the broken greenhouse and the sea beyond. He remembered assigning it through Mr. Rowe without thought, because it was warm enough, proper enough, distant enough. His hand lifted toward the door before sense returned. He had no right to enter the life she had built in his absence merely because guilt had finally made him restless. Then he heard voices from within, low and gentle. Grace was speaking to someone, perhaps the old housekeeper. "No, Mrs. Bell, the children must have the thicker blankets. I have the quilt from the cedar chest." A pause. Then Mrs. Bell's worried reply, muffled through the wood. "Your Grace, you were pale at dinner." Grace gave a soft laugh, almost breathless. "I am often pale. It is not a tragedy." His Grace noticed. Silence followed. Caleb could feel it. "Notice things are not the same," Grace said at last. "That is different." The words entered Caleb cleanly, without drama, without mercy. He lowered his hand. Inside the room, Grace continued arranging comfort for others while dismissing the cost to herself. Outside the room, the Duke of Ashbourne stood like a stranger, discovering that neglect did not end when a man returned. It merely became visible. He turned away before the women could know he had been there. At the stair landing, he looked down into the entrance hall, where white heather caught the last glow of the lamps. Grace had not covered his mother's portrait. She had not banished the old sorrow. She had simply turned it toward the light, but not too much. That restraint undid him. For the first time in 8 months, Caleb understood that his wife had not healed Ravenshade by pretending it was never wounded. She had healed it by staying where he had fled. Morning came to Ravenshade in a wash of pearl-grey light, softening the cliffs but not the questions Caleb had carried through the night. He descended before breakfast, expecting to find the household still under the slow discipline of dawn, but the manor had already awakened without waiting for him. In the kitchen corridor, flour dusted the air like pale smoke. Mrs. Bell stood at the long table with 2 village women, cutting loaves into thick slices while a boy no older than 7 carefully counted apples into a basket. Near the servants' entrance, a fisherman with weathered hands thanked Grace in a voice roughened by embarrassment, and Grace listened as if gratitude were something fragile that must never be made heavier by ceremony. She wore a simple blue morning dress with a shawl around her shoulders, her fair face tired but composed. Her hand rested for a moment against the table when she thought no one watched. Caleb watched. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Bell said when she noticed him, and the entire kitchen stiffened as if the old Ravenshade had returned in his boots. Grace turned slowly. For one quiet second, husband and wife stood among bread, steam, wet coats, and the stunned silence of people who did not know whether warmth required permission. Caleb could have restored order with a sentence. He could have reminded them this was a ducal household, not a harbor mission. Instead, his gaze fell on the boy with the apples, whose small fingers had frozen around one red piece of fruit. "You counted 9, Caleb said. The boy swallowed. "Yes, Your Grace." Caleb looked at the basket. "There are 10. The boy stared down, then carefully placed the last apple beside the others. A breath moved through the kitchen. Not relief, exactly. Wonder. Grace's expression changed so little that anyone else might have missed it, but Caleb saw the faint softening near her eyes. It was not forgiveness. It was only the recognition that he had not broken the morning. That, he found, mattered to him. After breakfast, he followed her through the east passage, where windows that had once been shuttered now stood open to the salt wind. "How many families come here?" he asked. "When the weather is fair, perhaps 3 or 4 a week. In storms, more? And you decided this alone?" "I was alone when I decided it." He stopped walking. Grace continued 3 steps before realizing he had fallen behind. She turned, one hand gathering her shawl at her throat. The corridor light made her look almost translucent, yet there was nothing weak in the way she faced him. Caleb felt the answer he deserved settle between them before he could speak. "I left you with a steward and sufficient funds." "You left me with rooms," she said. "Rooms do not answer when the wind is loud." He looked away toward the window, where gulls wheeled over the cliff. The words had been softly spoken, but they opened a door in him he had nailed shut years before. Rooms do not answer. His mother would have understood that. Grace moved on, not waiting to see whether the truth had wounded him. She led him to the greenhouse behind the east wing, a structure Caleb remembered as a ruin of cracked panes, rusted hinges, and dead vines. Now it glimmered beneath the pale sun. Not perfect. Not restored in the grand manner his ancestors would have demanded. But breathing. Wooden benches had been scrubbed clean. Clay pots lined the walls. White heather, rosemary, winter lettuce, and small orange trees stood in careful rows. At the center, a long table held children's slates, seed packets, and a chipped blue vase filled with flowers too modest to impress society and too stubborn to die. "This was my mother's greenhouse," Caleb said before he could stop himself. Grace looked at him with quiet attention. "I know." "Who told you?" "No one." Her initials are carved beneath the potting table. Caleb crossed the room and touched the old wood. E. W. Eleanor Whitmore. The letters were uneven, made by a young woman who must once have laughed here before the house swallowed laughter whole. He had not seen them since childhood. Grace remained near the doorway, giving him the dignity of not being watched too closely. I did not know whether to use it at first, she said. It felt like entering someone else's prayer. His hand closed on the edge of the table. Yet you did. Yes. Why? Grace looked around at the glass, the plants, the pale light gathering in fragile leaves. Because abandoned things do not become sacred merely because we are afraid to touch them. Caleb turned toward her. She had said it gently. That was the terrible thing. Grace's gentleness did not soften truth. It made truth impossible to dismiss. Outside, the sea struck the rocks below, steady as a heart continuing despite grief. Inside, Caleb stood in the room where his mother had once left proof of being young, and his wife, whom he had nearly turned into another sorrow, had filled it with living things. For the first time, he understood that Grace had not been waiting for him to give her a place in Ravenshade. She had taken the rooms he abandoned and taught them to belong to everyone who needed shelter. Including, though he did not yet deserve it, him. By noon, the Storm families had gone, leaving behind damp footprints, folded blankets, and a silence that no longer felt empty. Caleb remained in the greenhouse after Grace returned to the house, his gloved fingers resting on the old potting table where his mother's initials lay beneath a thin scar of dust. He should have gone to his study. There were letters from Boston waiting, shipping contracts to review, coal accounts to settle before winter deepened. Instead, he stood among white heather and rosemary, breathing in warm soil and salt air, as if the room had become a question he did not know how to answer. On the lower shelf, half hidden behind a stack of seed trays, he noticed a bundle tied with pale ribbon. The paper was familiar. Ravenshade stationery. His crest pressed into the corner of each page. Caleb should not have touched it. He knew that before his hand moved. Yet the ribbon came loose beneath his thumb, and the first sheet opened like a voice long trapped in a drawer. Your Grace, the east roof leaks above the nursery corridor. I have moved the children's books before the rain can spoil them. Mr. Rowe believes the repair will cost $12 if done before the next storm. The handwriting was Grace's, neat, restrained, without ornament. He turned to the next. Your Grace, Mrs. Bell's hands are worsening in the cold. I have asked the kitchen girls to take more of the heavy work, but she is proud and will not complain. If you approve, I would like to order better coal for the servants' hall. Another. Your Grace, a fisherman's wife came this morning with a child who could not stop coughing. The doctor says warmth and broth may do what medicine cannot. Ravenshade has both. Caleb read faster, then slower, because each letter carried no accusation, and that made them unbearable. Grace had not written as a lonely bride begging for tenderness. She had written as the keeper of a house he had abandoned, reporting its wounds with dignity. A cracked window. A sick tenant. A broken step near the west garden. A piano tuned for children who had never touched ivory keys. Then the last letter, dated 3 weeks before. His return. Only one line stood on the page. The manor is no longer silent. Caleb held that sentence until the words blurred in the greenhouse light. He remembered receiving envelopes in Boston and setting them aside unopened because the Ashbourne seal on pale paper made him think of duty, of illness, of a wife whose quiet presence unsettled the careful distance by which he survived. He had told himself anything urgent would be repeated by the steward. He had told himself Grace was provided for. He had told himself many things. The truth was smaller and crueler. He had not wanted to hear her. When he returned to the house, the afternoon had dimmed, and voices drifted from the music room near the south hall. Caleb paused outside the half-open door. Grace sat at the piano with 3 village children gathered beside her, guiding a little boy's hand toward the proper keys. Her touch was light, patient. Not harder, Samuel, she said. Only braver. The boy tried again, and a wavering melody rose into the room. Grace smiled. not the polite smile she had given Caleb. This one warmed her entire face, softening the tiredness around her eyes until she looked, for one breath, almost young enough to have been cherished. Caleb felt something tighten in him, not anger, not yet sorrow, but a kind of shame sharpened by wonder. He had left her with silence, and she had answered it with music. He had left her with locked rooms, and she had filled them with children. He had left her with his name, believing it a sufficient shelter, and she had built shelter with her own frail hands. Mrs. Bell appeared at the end of the hall carrying a folded shawl. She saw him, then the papers in his hand, and her expression changed. Not fear. Disappointment. It struck him with surprising force. Were these sent? Caleb asked quietly. The housekeeper glanced toward the music room. Every one, Your Grace. I did not answer. No, Your Grace. The old woman's voice remained proper, but propriety could not hide the judgment beneath it. Caleb looked back through the doorway. Grace laughed softly as Samuel found the melody, and the children laughed with her, bright as fire in a room that had once been sealed against joy. Did she wait for replies? He asked. Mrs. Bell folded the shawl more tightly against her arm. At first. 2 words. That was all. Caleb lowered his gaze to the letters. At first. A man could be condemned by an entire court, and feel less exposed than he did beneath those 2 quiet words. In the music room, Grace looked up and saw him standing there. Her smile did not vanish exactly. It withdrew, like a candle shielded from wind. She rose with graceful caution, one hand touching the piano for balance. Your Grace? She said. Caleb wanted to hide the letters. Instead, he held them where she could see. I found these in the greenhouse. Her eyes moved to the bundle, then back to his face. No panic. No shame. Only the calm of someone who had already endured the disappointment. Then you have found old news, Grace. It was the first time he had spoken her given name since his return. The children went still. So did she. Caleb heard the sea beyond the windows, the faint tick of the mantel clock, his own breath failing him. I should have answered. Grace's fingers rested on the piano's dark wood. Yes, she said. Nothing more. She gave him no comfort he had not earned, and somehow that was the beginning of truth between them. The next morning, Caleb discovered that Raven Shade obeyed Grace before it remembered him. It was not rebellion. That would have been easier to confront. It was devotion, quiet and complete, woven into the daily motions of the house. Mr. Rowe brought Grace the household ledger before placing the shipping correspondence beside Caleb's plate. Mrs. Bell asked Grace whether the winter preserves should be sent to the harbor families before Christmas. The youngest kitchen maid waited for Grace's nod before taking a basket of bread to the back gate, where 2 boys stood stamping their boots against the cold. No one ignored Caleb. They bowed. They answered. They called him Your Grace with flawless respect. Yet every living thread of the manor seemed tied to the pale woman at the breakfast table, her shawl folded neatly around her shoulders, her teacup untouched because she was too busy listening to everyone else. Caleb watched her sign a small order for coal, then paused to ask whether the delivery wagon could spare room for Mrs. Bell's nephew on the return trip. His mother lives near the South Road, Grace said. The walk is 3 miles, and the frost is hard this morning. Mr. Rowe nodded. Of course, Your Grace. Caleb set down his fork. Does every decision in this house pass through you now? The room went still, though Grace did not. She finished sanding the ink on the paper, closed the ledger, and looked at him across the breakfast service. Only the ones that cannot wait for Boston. A flush of silence followed. Caleb deserved it. He knew that. Still, the words struck the pride he had mistaken for order. I am here now. Yes, Grace said. You are. Nothing in her tone mocked him. That was worse. Caleb rose and walked to the window, where the lawn sloped toward the sea, silvered with frost. Below, near the greenhouse, Samuel from the music room carried kindling under the supervision of a footman, his small face bright with the importance of being useful. You have made them dependent on you, Caleb said. Grace's spoon touched the saucer with a sound as small and sharp as a pin. No. I reminded them they were allowed to depend on one another. He turned. And what happens when you exhaust yourself doing it? Then I rest. You do not rest. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time that morning, he saw a flicker beneath her composure. Not weakness. Weariness. You cannot know that, Your Grace. You are not here to see. He had no answer. The tide beat against the rocks below, patient as judgment. Later that afternoon, Caleb followed the household accounts into his study, determined to understand what Grace had done with the allowance left to her. He expected extravagance disguised as charity, inefficient generosity, the soft-hearted arithmetic of someone who had never managed an estate of consequence. Instead, he found precision. Every dollar recorded. Every repair weighed against need. $12 for roof patching. $4.70 for wool blankets. $1.15 for slate pencils. Nothing wasted. Nothing vain. Beside the accounts lay a second book, smaller, bound in worn green cloth. Caleb opened it and found names. Not transactions. Names. Abigail Morse, widow, 2 children, needs lamp oil. Peter Vale, injured hand, cannot mend nets until spring. Thomas Bell, boots too small, pride easily wounded, offer through Samuel. The final note stopped him. Caleb Whitmore, Duke of Ashbourne, avoids the East greenhouse, his mother's initials beneath the table. Do not move her blue vase. Caleb sat very still. She had been caring for him too, even in absence, even in hurt. Not with submission. Not with longing. With attention. The kind of attention he had refused to give her. A knock came before he could close the book. Grace entered carrying a folded list, then halted when she saw what lay open beneath his hand. Color touched her pale cheeks. That book is private. Caleb closed it at once. Forgive me. She seemed unprepared for the apology. So was he. For a moment, they stood on opposite sides of the desk, surrounded by ledgers, winter light, and all the things a marriage could fail to say. I thought you were spending recklessly, he admitted. Grace's mouth softened, though not into a smile. I thought you might. You have kept better accounts than my Boston clerks. Need teaches accuracy. He looked at her then, at the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes, at the steady hands folded over the list she had brought him, at the woman everyone in Ravenshade trusted because she had never treated their troubles as interruptions. Why did you do all this? He asked. To punish me? Grace's gaze did not waver. No, to prove you did not need me? No, then why? Outside the study windows, the lighthouse flashed once through the fog, vanished, then returned. Grace looked toward it before answering. Because houses remember what happens inside them. I did not want Ravenshade to remember only loneliness. Caleb felt the words move through him like the opening of a locked room. And me? He asked before pride could stop him. What did you want me to remember? Grace held his gaze, gentle and unyielding. That you had a home before you had the courage to come back to it. The list trembled once in her hand. Almost too slightly to see. Then she placed it on the desk and left him there, with the sea at his back, the ledger before him, and the terrible understanding that his wife had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been rescuing everything he was too wounded to touch. By late afternoon, the fog thickened over Cape Elizabeth until the world beyond Ravenshade seemed erased by a grey hand. The lighthouse appeared only in brief white pulses, each flash swallowed almost at once by mist and rain. Caleb had remained in his study after Grace left him, surrounded by ledgers that no longer looked like accounts but confessions. He had thought numbers would steady him. They did not. Every careful entry in Grace's hand reminded him that she had given Ravenshade something he had withheld from it since boyhood, attention without fear. Then the first bell rang from the harbor road. Not the household bell. The warning bell. Caleb looked up just as Mr. Rowe entered, his composure strained at the edges. Your Grace, a fishing boat has overturned near the outer rocks. 3 men have reached shore. Others may still be making their way in. The village is sending people toward the manor because the tide road is flooding. Caleb rose at once. Prepare the lower hall. Send blankets, lanterns, and hot water. Mr. Rowe hesitated, not because the orders were unclear, but because they were familiar. Her Grace has already begun. Caleb did not answer. He moved through the corridors quickly, following the rising motion of the house. Servants carried quilts down the stairs. Mrs. Bell shouted for more broth from the kitchen. The children who had been learning piano were herded gently into the morning room, where they could stay warm and out of the way. At the center of it all stood Grace, pale but steady, tying a wool shawl beneath her chin as she gave instructions with calm precision. The south parlor for the families. The blue room for anyone who needs quiet. Keep the fire low in the entrance hall until their coats are off, or the heat will shock them. Caleb stopped at the foot of the stairs. You are not going outside. Grace turned. Wind pressed rain against the windows behind her. There are people coming up from the harbor. And there are footmen, stable hands, and half the village to bring them. They will come faster if they see the manor lights. Then I will see to the lights. She looked at him, and for a moment he saw the full measure of her exhaustion, the faint color burning too brightly in her cheeks, the way her fingers tightened around the shawl, the breath she took as if the air had become a staircase too steep to climb. Caleb, she said, and the sound of his name in her voice nearly stopped him. These people trusted this house because I opened the door. I will not disappear when they are afraid. He had no defense against that. None. Together they went to the front steps, where rain swept across the drive in silver sheets. Caleb ordered every lantern lit along the path from the gate to the servants' entrance. Grace stood beside him, one hand on the stone rail, calling the first arriving families by name. She knew them all. Not as tenants. Not as burdens. As souls. Mrs. Vale, bring Peter through the kitchen. Samuel, take the little ones to Mrs. Bell. Thomas, leave the wet boots by the hearth. Her voice never rose, yet people followed it as if it were a lamp in deep water. Caleb moved beside her, lifting a child over a puddle, steadying an old man at the steps, opening his own front door again and again until cold rain ran beneath his collar. No one praised him. No one needed to. For the first time, he was not performing duty. He was staying. Then Grace coughed. Once. Twice. The third time, her hand flew to the rail. Caleb turned sharply. Grace. I am well. You are not. She straightened by force of will alone, her face now almost white beneath the lantern glow. At the far end of the drive, another wagon emerged from the fog. Grace stepped forward. Her knees weakened. Caleb caught her before she could fall, his arms closing around nothing but wool, rain, and frightening lightness. The entire entrance seemed to still. Grace's eyes opened, unfocused but stubborn. The children, she whispered. Inside, Caleb said, and his voice broke on the word. They are inside. The fire's lit. The blankets given. Her fingers touched his sleeve as if she were confirming he was truly there. Someone had to stay. The sentence passed through him like memory and judgment together. His mother, alone in bright rooms. Grace, alone in silent ones. Himself, always leaving before love could ask anything difficult of him. Caleb lifted his wife carefully, not as a duke claiming authority, but as a man terrified by the cost of his own absence. I am staying now, he said, though he did not know whether she heard him. He carried her through the open door while the storm followed at his back, and for the first time in his life, Caleb Whitmore crossed the threshold of Ravenshade not to escape its sorrow, but to protect the heart that had kept it alive. Caleb carried Grace to the east chamber himself, though Mrs. Bell followed with warm towels and Mr. Rose sent for the village doctor at once. The storm still pressed against Ravenshade, rattling the window panes and driving rain in silver streams down the glass, but inside the room everything had become painfully quiet. Grace lay against the pillows, her pale hair loosened over the quilt, her face so colorless that Caleb felt the old terror rise from the floorboards of his childhood. He had seen a room like this before. A woman too still. A candle burning too low. Men whispering outside the door because they did not know how to remain where helplessness lived. This time, Caleb did not leave. He removed his wet coat and sat beside her bed while Mrs. Bell placed a warm cloth across Grace's hands. The doctor arrived near midnight, smelling of rain and horse leather, and after a careful examination, he said what Caleb already knew in the hollow beneath his ribs. Exhaustion, chill, and a stubborn disregard for her own limits. She must rest. Truly rest, Your Grace. No household matters. No visitors. No standing in storms because someone else is frightened. Mrs. Bell looked toward Caleb as if to say that such miracles were now his responsibility. He accepted the judgment without protest. When the room emptied, Grace stirred. Her eyes opened halfway, clouded with fever and confusion. The families? She whispered. Caleb leaned closer, careful not to touch her too suddenly. Safe. The south parlor is full of blankets. Mrs. Bell has fed everyone twice. Mr. Rowe has put the children near the library fire. Grace's lashes trembled. The lighthouse road? Flooded, but the men are watching it. No one will travel until morning. She seemed to settle, but only slightly. Even half-conscious, she was inventorying need. Caleb looked around her room then, truly seeing it for the first time. It was not grand. The wallpaper had faded to the color of old cream. A small fire burned in the grate. On the writing desk lay a stack of folded lists, a mended glove, and a chipped cup filled with white heather. Beside the lamp was a sketch of Ravenshade in pencil, not as it had been when he left, shuttered and severe, but as it might become: windows open, greenhouse repaired, children near the garden path, smoke rising from every chimney. Beneath the drawing, in Grace's careful hand, were 4 words. A home, someday. Caleb stood as if struck. Not by drama. Not by surprise. By the unbearable gentleness of it. She had not written my home. She had not written his house. She had written a home, as if belonging were something that could be built slowly enough for wounded people to enter without fear. On the desk, he found another sheet, unfinished. It was a letter addressed to him, dated the morning before his return. The ink had stopped halfway down the page. Your Grace, the west rooms remain closed, but I have asked that they be dusted. I do not know what sorrow lives there, only that locked doors teach a house to fear its own memories. I hope one day Ravenshade may hold grief without being ruled by it. Caleb lowered himself into the chair by her bed. His mother's rooms. The West Wing. The place he had avoided for years with the discipline of a man calling fear by another name. Grace had known. Not the details, perhaps, but the shape of the wound. She had stepped around it with tenderness rather than curiosity. His hand moved to the edge of the quilt, stopping before it touched hers. I abandoned you, he said, the words low, stripped of title, defense, and pride. Grace's eyes opened. This time, they were clear enough to find him. For a moment, only the rain spoke. Yes, she answered. No cruelty. No comfort. Truth. Caleb bowed his head. I thought distance was mercy. I thought if I gave you comfort and did not ask for anything, I was sparing you from the kind of marriage my mother endured. Grace watched him in the candlelight, fragile and unyielding. Comfort without presence is only furniture, Caleb. His name, spoken so softly, undid what accusation could not. He drew one breath, then another. And still you saved my house. Her fingers shifted beneath the quilt, not reaching for him, only proving she was awake. No, she said. I saved myself first. The house followed. The answer hurt. It also freed him from the vanity of imagining her goodness had been for his redemption alone. Grace had not existed to heal him. She had chosen life when he had offered her only rooms. Caleb looked at the sketch again, at those 4 quiet words. A home, someday. Then teach me, he said. Grace's eyes softened, though exhaustion pulled at her. Homes are not taught in a night. Then I will begin with morning. She did not smile, but something in the room loosened, like a curtain released from a long winter nail. Caleb remained beside her until dawn grayed the windows, answering every small question she murmured about blankets, children, lanterns, and fires. Each time, he gave the same steady reply. Safe. Warm. Done. And with every answer, Ravenshade seemed to learn a new sound, not silence, not grief, but a man finally staying long enough to be believed. Morning came slowly, as if the storm had spent all its anger in the night, and left only a tired silver piece behind. Cape Elizabeth lay washed and gleaming beneath a pale winter sun, the flooded tide road shining like a ribbon of glass, the lighthouse standing white and watchful above the Atlantic. Inside Ravenshade, no one moved loudly. The rescued families slept near warm fires. Mrs. Bell guarded the kitchen like a general of mercy. Mr. Rose sent quiet reports to the east chamber, where Grace remained propped against pillows, wrapped in the blue quilt from the cedar chest, her face still pale but no longer frighteningly still. Caleb had not left her room except to give orders and return with proof that they had been done. By noon, he had written his first answer to one of her old letters. It was not elegant. It did not excuse him. The east roof will be repaired before the week ends. Mrs. Bell will have better coal. The children's books are safe. I should have listened. He placed it beside her teacup without ceremony. Grace read it once, then rested her fingers upon the page. You are answering a letter from 7 months ago, she said. Yes. It is rather late. Yes. Her mouth softened, not quite a smile, but something warmer than dismissal. Then you had better answer the rest. So he did. In the days that followed, Caleb began where pride least wished to kneel, with small things. He opened the west wing himself, not in a grand gesture before servants, but in the quiet of a gray afternoon, with Grace seated nearby in a chair because the doctor had forbidden her to stand too long. Dust rose in the old rooms like memory disturbed. His mother's blue vase still rested on the mantel, exactly where Grace had left it. Caleb touched it with 2 fingers, then opened the curtains. Light entered. Nothing shattered. That evening, he ate in the kitchen because Mrs. Bell needed more hands to pass bowls, and when Samuel played 3 uneven notes on the piano, Caleb listened instead of retreating to his study. The house noticed. Houses always do. Grace recovered by inches, and Caleb learned patience by inches beside her. He did not demand forgiveness, for he had come to understand that forgiveness given too quickly can become another burden placed upon the wounded. Instead, he became useful. He walked the 3 miles to the harbor road to inspect repairs. He arranged a permanent fund for the fishing families, not as charity tossed from a high window, but as a promise written into the estate accounts. He asked Grace before changing anything she had built, and when she disagreed, he listened. True listening, he discovered, was not silence while waiting to speak. It was surrendering the comfort of one's own certainty. By Christmas, Ravenshade no longer seemed surprised by warmth. Green garlands hung along the staircase. White heather bloomed in the greenhouse despite the cold. Children came twice a week for lessons, and the south parlor, once preserved for guests who never arrived, became a room where tired mothers drank tea while rain moved across the sea. On Christmas Eve, Caleb found Grace in the greenhouse, standing beside the old potting table with a shawl around her shoulders and winter sunlight resting on her fair hair. You should be sitting, he said. I am standing very carefully. The doctor did not prescribe careful standing. The doctor is not the Duke of Ashbourne. Neither is he foolish enough to argue with you. This time she smiled. Truly smiled. Caleb felt the sight settle in him with a reverence too deep for speech. He stepped beside her and placed a brass key on the potting table. Grace looked down. What is this? The master key to Ravenshade. Her gaze lifted to his. You already have one. I had possession, he said. You gave the house meaning. He took a slow breath, the kind required of a man learning not to flee his own heart. This was my house, Grace. You made it a home. If you allow me, I would like to spend the rest of my life earning a place in it. The wind moved softly against the glass. Somewhere beyond the hill, the lighthouse bell marked the hour. Grace did not rush toward him. She did not weep, nor did she erase the months of loneliness with one tender moment. She simply placed her hand over his on the key, light as a promise and warm as the first fire lit in a room long closed. Then stay, she said. Caleb bowed his head over their joined hands. I will. Years later, people in Cape Elizabeth would speak of Ravenshade Manor as the warmest house on the coast, the place where lamps burned through storms and no traveler was turned away from the door. They would speak of the Duchess with love, of the Duke with respect, and of the strange grace by which a silent manor had learned to sing. But Caleb would remember the truth more quietly. A home is not made by stone, title, or inheritance. It is made by the heart brave enough to remain, and the heart humble enough to return changed.